just to kind of get in, get situated, get their audio rolling. We've got a couple of announcements and some housekeeping items. So settle in. We're really glad you're with us. I think we've got a really wonderful webinar today to share with you all. And we've got a really outstanding member of our faculty here to share it with us. So we're excited about today. I think it's been a really timely and relevant topic, and we really appreciate you all being with us, whether this is the 10th time you've attended one of these webinars or the first time you've attended one of our webinars. So thank you all for being here. My name is Aaron Bockenheimer, by the way. I serve as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Engagement here at UNC Chapel Hill. And I have professionally been part of, I think, 3 of these mental health webinars in our ongoing series, and couldn't be more excited for the one we have happening today. You all may hear me repeat a few things a few times, but that's okay. Right? We learn by hearing repetitiously. So just a couple of things for today for those of you who are already on. The chat feature is enabled for today's webinar. And so you can use that to make comments with one another and to connect here with the production team if you're having any issues. There is also a Q&A feature enabled for today's webinar. And so that's where you should drop questions throughout the program. You don't have to wait till the end, but that is when Dr. Telzer will respond to questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A for that. All of you should be able to see questions that have been put in the Q&A that have not been answered, and you can upvote those questions. You can also submit questions in the Q&A anonymously. And then we will get to those at the appropriate time at the end. But again, we're really glad that you all are here. It looks like we've got 30 participants or so joined us so far. Hope you all can hear us okay. If there's any issues that you're having, please drop any questions or sort of production-oriented concerns or comments that you have in the chat feature. And again, if you all can use the Q&A for questions throughout the program today, that would be great. Again, if you're just joining us, we're going to wait one more minute to give folks an opportunity to get in, get settled, get their audio set up. I always feel like these webinars, and I've been saying this now for probably 4 or 5 years, that it feels a little bit like you're making popcorn, right? And the instructions always say like 3 minutes, but then the popcorn starts to slow down at like 2 minutes, and you're like, should I start it? Should I start it now? And then like a few more kernels pop. I feel that way about webinars, right? Like it's never exactly sure when exactly to start and when everybody's present. I don't know if anybody else ever feels that way. All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and just start running through some welcoming and some housekeeping items. So it is 12:03. We are going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Folks may continue to enter the webinar, but we're going to get rolling because we've got an action-packed hour and 20 minutes or so today with a great presentation and opportunity for Q&A. A couple of just housekeeping items before we get going. Some of you may have heard me mention this already. So the chat is enabled, and you can use that to communicate with one another throughout the presentation or connect with the production team. There is a Q&A enabled. And so that is where you should put questions for our presenter today. So please use the Q&A feature. You can do that anonymously if you choose. You can also upvote questions. So if you see a question that you're interested in, please feel free to use the upvote feature. Dr. Telzer will be answering questions at the end. So stick around through the end of the presentation, and that's when we will get into the questions that you all have provided for us. For any students that are with us, I know you are probably interested in CLE credit. CLE is available for this presentation, and the QR code will pop up. I think both now and at the end of the presentation for you all to be able to get on the QR and get CLE credit. So we're really glad to have you today talking about digital minds, brain development in the age of technology with Dr. Eva Telzer. Dr. Telzer, if you want to turn on your camera, and I'm going to give you an introduction. We are so glad you're with us today. Dr. Eva Telzer is a professor of psychology and neuroscience here at UNC Chapel Hill. She is an associate editor at Child Development and Social Cognitive Affective Neuroscience and the co-director of the Winston National Center on Technology Use, Brain Development and Psychological Development. Her research examines how social and cultural processes shape adolescent brain development with a focus on both prosocial and risk-taking behaviors, family and peer relationships, and the role of social media in youth's lives. She has authored over 200 publications and has received numerous awards for her work, including the American Psychological Association Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology. She is regularly featured as an expert in psychological science in consultation to government agencies and nonprofit associations, as well as the media. We are really grateful to have you all here today and you, Dr. Telzer, for this really sort of timely and really relevant conversation that I think folks are going to resonate with both professionally and educationally and intellectually and personally. So thank you for being here today. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And I will get my slides on here. All right. Great. So today I'm going to be talking about digital minds, brain development in the digital age of technology. And advancing my slides. Great. So in the span of a generation, social media has really drastically changed the landscape of adolescent development, providing unprecedented opportunities for social interactions around the clock. If you look at the way that peer relationships looked like decades ago, when adolescents were interacting with each other, peers looked more like this together. A couple decades later, they may have looked like this. And more recently, adolescents' peer interactions are oftentimes happening either behind a screen or together with a screen. And so their peer relationships have really dramatically transformed. Now, there's many ways in which technology has changed adolescents' peer relationships more so than any other technology. So for example, social media has some very unique qualities to them. So for example, one's interactions with peers can be asynchronous and not in real time. Adolescents can post things on social media that are very public and permanent for anyone to see anytime. Adolescents have this sort of pressure to be available around the clock. They are interacting with their peers nonstop. Social media doesn't end, or peer relationships don't end when adolescents go home at the end of the day. These peer interactions really continue because of social media. Cues on social media are very different than in real life or in-person interactions. There's an absence of real quality social cues that adolescents can use to navigate their social interactions and their social relationships with their peers. What's especially important when it comes to social media is that there's this very quantifiable nature to social media. We literally rate and vote each other and make this very quantified. You can count the number of likes somebody gets, the number of followers somebody has. Anyone can see this. What's really, really unique more recently is that many of our social relationships have literally been outsourced. A lot of the decision making that we have is now determined by a computer that controls what we see and who we talk to. So this has really changed the nature of social development. Now, social media allows for access to social information at any time it's desired. It's designed to hold users' engagement by maximizing social rewards through likes and followers and comments. Nearly all adolescents are on social media today. For example, 78% of 13 to 17-year-olds are checking their devices hourly, and 46% report that they're checking their devices constantly. And if you compare this to just 10 years ago, this was a rate of 24%. So this has nearly doubled in the past 10 years. So social media use is ubiquitous in teens' lives. Now, this rise in social media is happening at a critical developmental period when the brain is going through more development and more reorganization, second only to infancy. So if we look at the different brain regions that are developing, the brain is becoming extremely sensitive to its environment and becomes especially sensitive to social cues. The human brain has evolved to have regions that are sensitive to our social world. So these areas of the brain involved in social cognition mean that adolescents are oriented towards social stimuli, making teens very hypersensitive to their peers. At the same time, adolescents show these increases in brain regions involved in reward sensitivity, which increases adolescents' motivation to receive rewards, particularly from their peers. And if you imagine this on a social media context, these social media platforms are filled with rewards, meaning that adolescents are really driven to these platforms in ways because of their brain sensitivities. And this is all occurring during a period when the executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex is still developing. This all creates the perfect storm on social media. Adolescents are drawn to these platforms, to the social cues and the social rewards on social media at a developmental period when they have more difficulty resisting those urges. So as a result, adolescents are more likely to engage in social media at very high levels and potentially develop problematic social media behaviors that can have downstream effects on their mental health and their ability to focus in school and all aspects of their well-being. So what do we know about the role of social media on adolescent development? Well, I'm going to start with a few caveats before diving into a host of things that we've begun to study and understand about this. Now, the first and one of the hardest things about this is that there's this huge generational gap. Being a researcher or being a parent is very difficult today because as adults, we don't have our own experiences to necessarily rely on. Social media and technology have created one of the largest generational gaps. For the current generation of adolescents, there's a huge cohort effect. Everything is electronic, everything's happening online. Teens' lives are very different than their parents' lives were. Teens experience all kinds of things that their parents or other adults really never experienced and may not understand. And because of this, parenting can be very difficult. They have less knowledge of how social media and technology work, how teens are using it, how teens are navigating social media, and adults tend to have sort of less control and knowledge over these platforms to be able to navigate these new changing landscapes. At the same time, science is very hard. And so what I'm going to present to you today has many sort of challenges and caveats. Firstly, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? So for example, there's been a lot of hype in the news about how social media is creating the mental health crisis that we are seeing today. So on the one hand, there's research that does suggest that social media is related to later depression, but there's also research, for example, that shows that more depressed individuals use social media in different ways. So what comes first, the social media or the mental health? Similarly to this, correlation does not imply causation. So just because social media may be related to mental health does not mean that social media necessarily caused that mental health to develop. So it's very important for us to really understand these sort of nuances and the relationships. Now, technology changes very fast. before we sort of can keep up with one platform and study it and understand its implications on adolescent well-being, that tech has completely changed. As an example of this, about 5 or 6 years ago, when we first launched the Winston National Center for Technology Use, we were very invested in understanding what is it that adolescents are doing online? What are their behaviors online and on social media platforms that might impact their mental health? Well, today, just less than 5 years later, we're trying to understand the role of algorithms and AI because this has completely changed how adolescents navigate with their social media platforms. So before we can finish answering one question, tech has really transformed so that we're asking new questions. And at the same time, research is very slow. It takes us years and years to collect some of the data and present and understand the results that I will share with you today. So there are some key assumptions we need to start with because it's a pretty complex relationship and much more so than many people think. So social media is not just one homogeneous experience that can easily be understood. Social media is a combination of the content that adolescents create and the content they're exposed to on social media, as well as the different platform features such as likes or upvoting, as well as the algorithms. And all of these together sort of change and shape adolescent social media experiences. So we can't merely ask how long are adolescents spending on social media or on technology and be able to understand how that time relates to an outcome, because it has so much more to do with the content and the platform functions and the algorithms that are really changing and shaping those experiences. There's no age at which it's okay or not okay to be on social media. Teens don't wake up on a certain birthday with the competencies that they didn't have before, because adolescent development is very gradual and adolescents are slowly developing and gaining the skills to navigate these social media platforms. Now, many things in adolescents' offline world, such as racism or biases that are very prevalent and are oftentimes more common and worse in their online worlds, whether that is biases built into algorithms or different forms of bullying that become more extreme in online platforms. Causal data are largely unavailable because it is oftentimes hard to say with some of our methods that social media causes some of these outcomes. And so we're just starting to get there with our science, but we do need to be a little bit cautious in making these causal claims. And so it's likely a much more complex relationship than you've likely heard so far. So our sort of main message is that we're trying to understand under which specific conditions and for which specific children who may have either vulnerabilities or resiliencies coming into these platforms, and which may particularly be determined by the specific features or content that adolescents are exposed to, that can help us determine whether that is helpful or harmful to adolescents' development. So these are a number of the questions that we are asking in the Winston Center here on campus. And I'm going to go through all of these and talk about the different ways in which we're studying social media, ranging from some of the potential benefits of technology use at the top there, all the way to the bottom of how technology use might be shaping the developing brain. So I'm going to start with some of the potential benefits. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is not necessarily beneficial. So I do want to emphasize some of the positive aspects of social media for adolescents, because if we want to identify ways to limit or take away social media from youth, we also need to recognize the youth who also benefit the most from these platforms, and limiting their access could have potential consequences. For instance, adolescents who come from marginalized backgrounds or communities who are underrepresented may have opportunity to connect with other like-minded individuals who share their identity, who they might not have as many opportunities to connect with in their in-person lives. So social media provides adolescents with access to affinity groups and identity communities whom they might not have access to in their offline worlds. Now, social media provides really rapid social support. Adolescents can reach out and gain access to support at any time. And this is very important, particularly if adolescents are struggling with mental health. Adolescents often have friends online that they know that they are never going to meet. So these are online only friends. And those friendships are oftentimes very strong and can buffer adolescents, for instance, from the effects of stress and suicide behavior. Now, adolescents' online networks and friends are oftentimes more diverse than their offline friends and networks, really exposing adolescents to more diverse perspectives. And finally, adolescents engage in civic engagement and activism online in ways that they sometimes don't have access to in their offline worlds. Adolescents are also utilizing social media in ways to make their activism reach bigger audiences. Some of the biggest societal movements of today are being driven by adolescents by using social media platforms. So for all of these reasons, social media has some large benefits to some adolescents, but not necessarily all adolescents. And it might depend on how adolescents use social media. So when adolescents go online and use social media in ways in which they might be comparing their bodies to other people, comparing and making upward social comparisons, for example, looking at other people and wishing that they had lives like their peers, comparing their bodies to other people's bodies, or engaging in this like reassurance or feedback seeking behavior where they're seeking that from their peers. This type of use is related to a host of negative outcomes, including depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and weight related behaviors. And while for the most part, this has been studied in the context of adolescent girls who engage in a lot of social comparisons to their peers, our emerging research is also showing that boys are also suffering on social media when they engage in these social comparisons as well. Oops. Now, another way that social media is impacting adolescents is through exposure to cyber hate. And this is a major concern. And this comes in the form of cyberbullying, online discrimination, hate messages, when adolescents are either receiving messages of cyber hate or even witnessing others receive that kind of cyber hate. So right here, this is showing the percentage of adolescents who have either experienced cyber hate as the victim or have seen other peers or teens be experience cyber hate. And as you can see here, about 12% of adolescents have experienced cyber hate directly, but a much larger percentage, nearly 3 times as many teens witness cyber hate than are the target themselves. And this is very concerning because experiencing cyber hate, but also witnessing cyber hate is associated with lots of negative outcomes, including later anxiety and depression, even when we account for adolescent offline experiences with either discrimination experiences or other hateful experiences that they have in their offline worlds. So these online negative experiences have pretty detrimental effects on adolescents' mental health. And it not only affects the victims, but it affects the bystanders. So adolescents who are witnessing these types of messages online are also at risk for experiencing negative mental health. Now, adolescents today have this constant pressure to be connected around the clock. There's no break anymore from their social connections. When I was a kid growing up in high school, I would go home after school, and if I wanted to have a social connection with a peer, I had to get on the phone to reach out to my friends. And sometimes there was a busy signal, so I couldn't necessarily always get through. But now there is this constant social connection. There's no such thing anymore as a busy signal. There's no such thing anymore as going home after school or on the weekends and getting to disconnect from one's social relationships or social connections. So there is this constant connection overload. Today, adolescents have this fear of missing out. They have to be available around the clock. And if they disconnect, they might miss out on something important. There are social norms. We're providing their peers with constant sort of feedback on their posts, being available around the clock, having these connections late into the night is a strong pressure amongst adolescents. And this is something that researchers have described as digital stress. So when adolescents are experiencing this high level of connection overload and this fear of missing out, this need to be connected around the clock, this is referred to as digital stress. And almost half of high schoolers, this percentage right here is 45% of high schoolers who are reporting significant digital stress to the point at which it's sort of interfering with their daily lives. And those who report higher digital stress are showing higher levels of depression, anxiety, as well as increased loneliness. And over the course of a year, adolescents with high digital stress are showing increases in their digital symptoms and their depressive symptoms, sorry, 1 year later. So there's these long-term effects of experiencing high digital stress on adolescents' mental health over time. Now, what adolescents are exposed to online can influence their own attitudes and subsequent behaviors. So, peer influence is a pretty strong effect that happens in the adolescent years when peers really have an undue influence on adolescents' behaviors and attitudes. And this is especially the case online. So, for example, when adolescents are exposed to, for example, their peers posting pictures of alcohol with likes attached to them, it has a significant effect on adolescents' perceptions of their peers' attitudes and their peers' values about drinking heavily. So, for example, if an adolescent is exposed to one post of an alcohol related post of a peer posting this, then this changes adolescents' perceptions that all their peers value engaging in heavy drinking. So they may misperceive because of this one post that this is the value, the social norm of their peers. And once teens have perceived that their peers approve of this behavior, this relates to their own initiation of heavy episodic drinking. And for adolescents, this is 6 or more beverages or 6 or more alcoholic drinks at one time. So a very heavy amount of drinking for an adolescent to engage in. Now, while this can be a bad thing, this applies to other behaviors too. So, for example, this can promote adaptive behaviors. For example, if adolescents are exposed to peers engaging in pro-social behaviors or activism or other positive behaviors, this can change their perception of their peers' attitudes about that behavior and can actually lead to adolescents engaging in more of that behavior. So, more activism or more academic focus or whatever the behavior might be. And so the really important point here is that what adolescents are exposed to on social media, especially if there's a lot of likes attached to that photo, can end up affecting adolescents' real life behaviors by changing the way they think that their peers value different behaviors. Now, poor sleep is very prevalent during the adolescent years. Adolescents are really deprived on average. This right here is showing the percent of adolescents in high school, so 9th through 12th grade, who get the recommended 8 hours or more of sleep per night. And this is before we even take any consideration of social media or technology into account. So on average, adolescents in the 9th grade, only about 40% of them are getting enough sleep. And by 12th grade, only about a quarter of adolescents are getting the recommended amount of sleep that they need in order to function. Now, this is very troubling because poor sleep and inadequate sleep is related to a host of negative outcomes. Adolescents who don't get the recommended 8 hours of sleep are more at risk for mental health, like depression, perform more poorly in school, they're sleepier throughout the day. It's related to obesity, it's related to substance use, you name it. Not getting enough sleep is related to a host of negative outcomes. And when we add technology and social media into the equation, it looks even more sort of bleak for adolescents. So when we look at the data across a meta-analysis, so this is looking across dozens and dozens of studies, about 60% of adolescents across all of these studies report that they are viewing or interacting with screens in the hour before bedtime. So the majority of adolescents are on their phones before bedtime. And so the question is, does this bedtime screen time use affect adolescent sleep, and how might this impact adolescents functioning? So we've done work to look at what happens when adolescents engage in smartphone use at nighttime, and we find consistent links with poor sleep health. So adolescents who are using their phones at nighttime, although not in the daytime smartphone use is not necessarily associated with this, but nighttime smartphone use is related to later sleep onset. So adolescents go to bed later when they were on their phones in the hours before bedtime. And this relates to shorter sleep duration. And the reason is because they still have to wake up at the same time to go to school the next day. So when they're going to bed later, but still have to wake up early for school, they end up getting less sleep that night. Moreover, what's really interesting is that if adolescents wake up in the middle of the night, so if they went to bed, they're asleep, but they wake up in the middle of the night, if they reach over for their phone, during that wake event is extended. So when adolescents engage with their smartphone during a wake event in the middle of the night, this extends and makes that wake event even longer, which disrupts their sleep even more. Now, this is particularly concerning because sleep is so essential for brain health. Adolescents need sleep in order for the neural connections in their brains to form during this very important developmental period. So, as I mentioned earlier, adolescence is a period of rapid brain growth. Sleep is very essential to that rapid brain growth. And this is showing white matter development in the brain. White matter is key for these connections across the brain, for information to flow across the brain and for that to develop well. And when adolescents are getting poor sleep, they're showing less development of these white matter tracts in the brain. So this is very concerning when it comes to nighttime phone use, because it could potentially be impacting the way that their brains are developing, which of course will have long-term downstream effects on their adjustment across their development. Now, some social media use is perfectly fine and is not necessarily going to be maladaptive. Again, remember, it depends on the content they're exposed to, the platform features, and the algorithms that might determine whether or not that is positive or negative. But there's a point at which social media behaviors become more problematic, and that's when they start to interfere with adolescents' daily functioning. When adolescents are no longer able to sort of resist being on social media, when they can't get away from it, when it starts interfering with their sleep, as I just talked about, or their schoolwork, or their ability to focus, this might be a sign that the social media is potentially more problematic. Now, we've developed some measures to get at how problematic might social media be. And then what I'm going to show you, we took the DSM criteria for substance use and we changed out the words of substance use for social media. And we asked adolescents to indicate whether any of these statements were true of themselves. And again, these are basically looking at substance use, addiction, and changing the words out for social media. And as I show you these different questions, these are questions that we asked teens, but I want you to sort of reflect on these yourself, because for many of us, I imagine we would probably answer yes to a lot of these questions. So do you ever feel like you spend more time on social media than you intended? Have you ever tried to spend time away from social media, but you couldn't? Do you ever expend extra effort to make sure you'll continue to have access to social media at times when you otherwise not be able to use it? Do you ever have a craving or strong desire to use social media? Does social media use ever get in the way of things you're supposed to be doing, like sleep, exercise, or schoolwork? Do you ever use social media even after you realized that it was getting in the way of what you thought was best for you? Have you ever been away from social media and felt like you were missing it too much to engage in normal day activities? And we also asked adolescents to sort of reflect, do you think you may be addicted to social media? And here's what we find. So nearly all adolescents report that they're spending more time on social media than they intended. Half of adolescents report that being away from social media results in experiencing difficulties in engaging with daily activities. Oops. And a quarter perceive that they are moderately or severely addicted to social media. So, for the majority of adolescents, they're showing signs that social media has become problematic to the point at which it may even be addictive for them. And perhaps this is no accident. These social media platforms are literally designed to draw in adolescents' attention, to keep them coming back for more. The platform features are designed to give them this little dopamine hit, to take advantage of that reward sensitivity and that need to connect on social media that is going to keep them coming back and coming back and coming back. And these are some documents that have been made publicly available showing that TikTok and Meta and many of the other social media platforms have literally built this into their features on purpose. So, for example, if we look at this Meta quote, this is from the founding president of Meta, who explicitly acknowledges this. So, the thought process that went into building these applications, Facebook being the first of them, was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. That means that we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. And that's going to get you to contribute more content, and that's going to get you more likes and comments. It's a social validation feedback loop, exactly the kind of thing a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. So the inventors of these platforms, they're pretty smart. They know how the brain works, and they know how the adolescent brain works as well, especially teenagers. Um, and so it is no accident that the majority of adolescents are essentially hooked to these platforms in a way that is interfering with their daily lives. Now, this up until now is talking about sort of how the adolescent brain might be in this developmental state of flux that makes social media experiences potentially different for an adolescent relative to, for example, an adult. Their brains are more sensitive to that dopamine hit that is going to draw them in more. But it's also the case that the adolescent brain may be shaped by adolescent social media experiences. So the rise in social media is happening at this very important developmental period when the brain is undergoing more development and reorganization second to infancy. And the brain is becoming very sensitive to its environment. It becomes especially sensitive to these social cues and especially rewards. So that dopamine hit that the Meta president is very aware of. And these are the exact types of cues that are just so prevalent on social media platforms. And so, on the one hand, adolescents may be especially sensitive to social media contexts, but also social media may shape the way the brain is developing. Oops. Social media platforms are delivering this constant flow of social feedback in the forms of likes and comments and notifications and messages. It's designed to hold users' engagement by maximizing those social rewards. And because the brain is so sensitive to the social environment, and it's especially plastic during adolescence, social media may be shaping the way that the brain is developing across adolescence by tuning the brain to seek out more rewards. So we at the Winston Center are very interested in potentially how this social media behavior, how habitual social media use across adolescence might be linked to longitudinal changes in how the brain processes social rewards over time. Now, what we found in some of our earlier work is that adolescents are, and perhaps not surprising to many of you, constantly checking their social media accounts. If we look at how often they are looking and checking their social media accounts, some adolescents are looking and accessing their phones upwards of 500 times a day. On average, adolescents are on their phone over 8 hours a day, and some adolescents are on their phones upwards of 16 hours a day. They are glued to their phones. They are constantly checking their phones, constantly looking for notifications, seeking back approval from their peers, checking their posts to see how many likes they got. They're constantly checking social media. So the question is this habitual social media behavior going to be associated with how their brain is developing over the next several years? So what we did is we brought in adolescents when they were in the sixth grade, so early adolescents around the age of 12, and we looked at the frequency with which they're checking their social media accounts. And then we brought them into the Biomedical Research Imaging Center on Carolina's campus, and we scanned their brains. And we scanned their brains while they were anticipating feedback from their peers. So we're able to look at how the brain processes this anticipation of peer feedback longitudinally over the course of early adolescence. And what we found is that adolescents who are habitually checking their social media accounts, that's this blue line here, are showing differences in how their brain develops over time. So this is how their brain activated at age 12 and how it changed in brain activation across adolescence up to age 16. And this looks very different than the way that adolescents who are never checking their social media accounts, how their brain is developing. So this is showing activation and change in activation across development and these areas of the brain that are very sensitive to motivational salience. So these are areas of the brain that are telling you this is important, pay attention to it. And we were scanning their brains while they were anticipating feedback from their peers. So this is telling us that adolescents who are habitually checking their social media accounts are becoming hypersensitive in these areas of the brain that are telling them this is important, pay attention to that peer feedback. So their brain is really becoming hypersensitive over time, in contrast to adolescents' brains who are never on social media. And this is very important because it might impact how they behave, how they react, how they engage with social media as they develop into late adolescence and into adults. So repeated exposure to rewards from peers, whether that's notifications or likes or comments, may be increasing adolescents' neural sensitivity to more rewards, potentially reducing their ability to resist urges to check their social media and really maintaining that social media engagement or even increasing that social media engagement over time. Now, the adolescent brain is really wired to seek social acceptance and to connect with peers, to crave social rewards, to seek out likes, to avoid social punishments such as peer rejection. And so these social media experiences may be exacerbating what we know is an already sensitive brain and further tuning adolescents to seek out more social rewards over time. And this may create this feedback loop. And Meta's president discussed this feedback loop in that little quote that I shared. So there's potentially this sort of bi-directional relationship. So the adolescent brain is already in this state of flux. It is very sensitive to its social environment. It seeks out those dopamine hits, and that may lead adolescents to engage in social media in different ways and to seek it out more. And then those social media experiences, by giving adolescents more sort of social rewards and comments and these intermittent rewards that come through different likes and mechanisms of social media, can potentially affect the way that the brain is developing. And social media therefore may have the potential to really shape the developing brain during this sensitive developmental period. And the brain is then going to seek out social media more. And so there may be this sort of endless feedback loop that we're seeing during the adolescent period. So what can we do? What can we do either as parents or teachers or even adolescents ourselves? Now, despite the sort of assumption that this is sort of a one-sided battle, adolescents and even young adults want time away from their phones. They want to do better. They want to have healthier social media experiences, but they struggle with it and they want to disconnect, but it's hard. So, what are some strategies that we can do to help? Now, one thing I recommend everybody to look at is this health advisory on social media use in adolescents that the APA put out, and this was chaired by Mitch Prinstein, who is a professor in the psychology and neuroscience department here at Carolina, as well as now the chief scientific advisor at APA. And so, together with a host of experts in the field, they put together some recommendations. And so if you go to APA's website, these are readily available there, but I'll talk through some of them and give a little bit of detail on a few of them. So here is just a screenshot of those from the website, and we'll go through some of them. So the first is that it's very important to encourage the functions of social media that can promote healthy socialization. So youth psychological development can really benefit from healthy online social interactions, whether that is these healthy online only friends, particularly during periods of social isolation. So when youth are experiencing stress, they can seek out connection to peers online. But we need to be able to help them seek out these healthy forms of social media that promotes really healthy relationships and emotional intimacy. At the same time, we need to discourage functions that are not suitable for children's maturity. So some features like recommended content or unrestricted time limits or this sort of endless scrolling combined with some of the AI that might feed into some negative content that adolescents receive, as well as changes to privacy policies. We need to be able to tailor these to the social and cognitive abilities and comprehension of adolescent users. For many of us, if you go to some of the privacy settings on social media platforms, we don't necessarily know what we're sort of signing up for. And certainly young children and adolescents don't know either. So adolescents should be informed very explicitly and perhaps with the help of parents who become more sort of digitally educated and in age appropriate ways, discuss how their behaviors on social media can yield data that can be used and stored and shared with others, for example, for commercial purposes. So adolescents and younger children need to be really told how their behaviors and how their social media use is being used for profit, essentially, and how some of the features are not necessarily going to be suitable for children's maturity. Now, parental monitoring for adolescents needs to be a combination of both restrictive monitoring, but also more active monitoring. So, merely setting limits and telling adolescents you can't go on is not really effective with adolescents' developmental needs for autonomy. And we really need to validate the importance of their online lives when discussing parental monitoring with teens. And so the solution is not only parental controls and screen time restrictions, but the most effective approach is really to listen to what adolescents say about their online experiences, to have open discussions. And this includes parents and teachers also taking a hard look at their own phone habits too. So if parents or teachers are constantly behind their screens or engaging in some problematic social media behaviors, it's going to be very hard to parent an adolescent to not do the same. Now, there is a lot of maladaptive exposure online. We need to minimize exposure to that type of content. So, for example, at least a third, if not half, of adolescents are exposed to some of this maladaptive content. Media often is depicting illegal or psychologically maladaptive behaviors, ranging from alcohol use or content that encourages youth to engage in health risk behaviors like self-harm or harm to others, or encourage eating disordered behaviors. And this really needs to be minimized, reported, and removed. Evidence is suggesting that exposure to this maladaptive behavior can promote similar behavior, especially among vulnerable youth. Similarly, we need to minimize exposure to hateful content as well as discuss it with adolescents, because even adolescents who have not directly been the target of cyber hate and who witness it are at risk for maladjustment. And so we really need parents and teachers and others to discuss this with adolescents to make sure that they have the appropriate coping mechanism so it doesn't affect their psychological adjustment. We need to routinely screen for signs of problematic use that can impair adolescents' ability to engage in life and routines. We oftentimes screen for other aspects of problematic behaviors, whether that might be mental health problems or physical health concerns, but there's rarely any sort of checks and balances when it comes to problematic social media use. So we need to sort of routinely look to make sure that adolescents are not having any signs of this problematic use. For example, asking adolescents if they've tried to reduce their screen time but can't. Have they gone to extreme measures? Are they lying to their parents or their teachers to retain access? Is their social media use and screen time interfering with their daily lives? Parents and clinicians should regularly screen for adolescents for these indicators of problematic use. I think one of the best and easiest things to actually implement, it's very hard to implement a lot of the things I've talked about today, but one of the easiest things to implement is to limit technology use at night. Take phones out of children's rooms, take technology out of adolescents' bedrooms. Take it out of adults' bedrooms too, because when individuals engage in screen time in the hours before bed, or when they wake up in the middle of the night and they reach over for their phone, that's going to dramatically interfere with their sleep. And sleep is so important for everything. So if all parents and adults for that matter turn technology off at night, hours before bedtime, and keep phones out of the bedroom, this could have one of the most dramatic impacts on youth functioning throughout their development. This can also benefit their physical activity as well. We need to limit use, the types of use that adolescents that are most maladaptive for adolescents. So, for example, behaviors that are encouraging social comparison or beauty ideals that are unattainable or things that are focused on appearance related content. This is particularly negative for adolescents. And so it's important for parents and individuals to monitor what adolescents are doing online, because if it's these types of behaviors, that's the things that we need to try to limit the most. Perhaps most importantly, we need to precede technology use, social media use in particular, with social media literacy. Adolescent social media use really needs to be preceded with these psychologically informed competencies and skills that can maximize the chance for balanced, safe, and meaningful social media use while minimizing the potential harms that come from social media. And I've listed some of these here that APA put together that can help us develop ways to teach teens, but also adults, digital and social media literacy. And finally, we need to wait for technology. Most parents report that they allow their adolescents or children to either have a phone or have access to social media because they fear that their child will be the only one not using it. But actually, this should not be the reason to give adolescents or children access to phones. We teach a class here on campus, Psych 180, which is a class on social media and tech use. And one of the main themes that has come from this class is that a lot of the undergrads in our class tell us that they wished that their parents had waited to give them access to technology, because it's a lot easier to have your parents saying no than to have access to it and not be able to sort of get away from the exposure to all of these things that adolescents may not have yet the competencies to deal with. So there are many ways to wait. There's one There's one initiative going on, this idea of wait until eighth, which is a parent-led campaign trying to get parents to wait at least until eighth grade to give their adolescents access to phones and technology. And so with that, I am going to end and open it up to questions. I also want to show here a handbook that we edited that's freely accessible that goes into lots of detail about all of the science we know about the role of adolescent digital media use and mental health, ranging from chapters on sleep and brain development to chapters on depression and loneliness and peer relationships. So if you're interested, you can go to this website here and have access to that book, and it's totally free and open access. So thank you for listening, and I'll be excited to answer any questions.
Dr. Telsler, that was awesome. That was fantastic. I am trying to start my video back, but I can't. Which is okay. Maybe I don't need to be. Maybe nobody needs to see my face. That's all right. That was a really wonderful presentation. I really appreciate your time. We don't have any questions in the Q&A yet, but until we do, if it's okay, I've got maybe one or two to get us rolling, if that's all right.
Great.
So we let's see. Maybe I'm good now. Look at that. Here I am. Hi. Hi. So until we get a question, we hear a lot about screens and attention span, right? And I know you've talked about sort of correlation and causation, but wonder if you could talk a little bit about how exposure to short duration content,
Mm.
like on a TikTok, for example, or a Snapchat, how those types of videos it might influence attention span.
Yeah, so the research on this is just emerging, and we're actually about to collect some data looking at just this question. But we know that these sort of really short duration videos that draw your attention in and sort of go on to the next thing before you become less interested, is a way to sort of keep you in this feedback loop on these platforms. And so they certainly are affecting your attention span in the moment, but also are going to affect attention spans, for example, in the classroom, when reading, when trying to engage in more in-depth focused work. And that is an area that we're starting to explore a lot, is really trying to understand how this manifests into attention in the classroom or their ability to focus, or how technology itself may really shape their ability to multitask. There's this misperception that, for example, having access to these short form videos or social media on sort of one screen and your homework on the other screen, and that we can multitask. But the evidence is pretty clear, if not explicitly clear, that although we think we can multitask, it is very challenging, and our ability to focus and not only complete things in an efficient amount of time, but to do a really good job is significantly impaired.
Yeah, what do they say? Like multitasking is really just doing all the things poorly, right? Like
Yes.
doing
Yeah.
none of the things well.
Yeah.
That's great. So we have a question from our participants today, and I'm going to read the question and then sort of maybe tie it to a broader question, right? So the question is, do you support banning or enforced age limits on social media apps like TikTok or Instagram? You obviously talked about some parental-led kind of movements and things like that, but there have been discussions about sort of more strict policy-oriented approaches like banning or enforced age limits. And then sort of a broader question is sort of what is the broader responsibility of either the companies
Mhm.
that are making and sharing these products, or is it really come down to kind of like it's up to individuals, it's up to families, it's up to individuals who are using these products or platforms to make their own determinations?
Yeah, that is such a hard question to answer. Like I said in the beginning, there's not like an age at which somebody is suddenly capable to manage some of the risks of social media. And like I said, there's some benefits. So taking it away could harm some people. Um, that being said, I do think that having some age restrictions is going to be important. And as more and more sort of data comes out showing some of the pretty extreme risks associated with access to social media and some of the harms that adolescents are exposed to at a developmental period of really extreme vulnerability, I think it's more and more important for this sort of idea to wait for technology. So I do think that age restrictions are important. Deciding what that age limit is, I think, is the biggest challenge. When it comes to what do we do about this? I mean, until the social media companies are held accountable, we as the consumers, as the parents or teens or teachers or whomever we are, need to do our best to navigate this ourselves. So I don't think that social media is going away. I don't think that social media will quickly become a safe space for all. And so I do think that a lot of the impetus is on us as users and consumers of the product to really look under the hood at the privacy, and how our data is being used and how we can protect, especially the youth, from some of the harms that they might be exposed to.
Great. So you've obviously talked and focused today on research and your research related to adolescence and social media, but we've got a question from one of our participants. Have you done any research, and I might amend, or are you aware of research on how technology affects small children and brain development? So specifically concerned about, for example, grade school children using iPads and games and e-learning.
Yeah, there is some research out there. We haven't done it in the Winston Center yet. In some ways, using technology for learning and in the classroom and amongst younger children is not going to be negative per se. In fact, it can be very positive. We live in a digital world now, and so adolescents or children, sorry, um, are growing up in an increasingly digital world. And so being able to use those tools from a young age is going to be important for their development. And those tools, especially for youth, for example, who might have developmental delays, whether it is being autistic or having ADHD or other things that make potentially sort of classroom learning more challenging, technology can actually really benefit, especially those kinds of developing populations who can really benefit from it.
Awesome. Um, I also noted, and again, we talking about adolescence. Sometimes the term adolescent is sort of understood exclusively as teenagers, but many folks on the call are probably aware, maybe some are not, that often we talk about the adolescent brain, right, developing all the way up until the through the mid 20s, right? So I wonder if you could. It may not be your specific area of focus, but if we have college students, either undergraduate or graduate students, even young adults, folks who are even maybe a little older. My brain's done developing, but there may be folks out there. Can you talk a little bit about sort of any research that either you all are doing or others are doing, sort of beyond the teenage years, right? Beyond the high school years, and are we seeing similar impacts later in the development of the
Yeah.
brain in the early 20s and mid 20s?
Yeah, great question. So I think that the more modern definition of adolescence is age sort of 10 to 25. And this is a pretty broad age range. But when we think, and this comes from research on brain development, and when we think about how the brain is changing and developing in this very unique developmental period, puberty starts sort of the influx of changes that are happening in the brain. And pubertal hormones start to change the brain about 2 years before any sort of physical signs of pubertal maturation are happening. And so that's usually around 10-ish. And the brain development is continuing to sort of be refined and shaped into the mid 20s. One of the most interesting findings is research that shows that this sort of young adult period, so 18 to 22-year-olds, they show differences in their brain activation patterns that are more similar to adolescents than they are to adults, for example, at the age of sort of 30 onwards. So this college aged age range, sort of 18 to 22, their brains are actually still changing in very important ways that resemble more so sort of a typical adolescent brain than they do a full adult brain. And so many of the things that I presented today are very applicable to one's experiences into the mid 20s when the brain is really still going through a lot of these shifts and changes.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. One of the things we spend a lot of time talking about here at Carolina is resilience, right? And dealing with life's challenges and learning skills and possessing skills that help you deal with life's ups and downs. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether or not there are personality traits or cognitive styles that might make some people more resilient
Mhm.
to the negative effects of technology or less resilient to the effects of technology.
Yeah, there's a lot of different sort of individual differences that we can think about that might make somebody more or less resilient. These can range from things within the person to things within their sort of social milieu. So having very supportive family and peer relationships can help buffer adolescents if they do experience some negative online experiences. So having these really strong offline social connections, whether that's with parents or peers or other supportive people, this is very important for adolescents. There's also features of the adolescent themselves. So for some adolescents, and we've done research in the Winston Center on this, different features of one's development, and this can be measured, for example, in the brain. So some adolescents are more sensitive to the negative features of social media, and some adolescents are very resilient to social media because their brains are more sensitive to the environment. So if adolescents who are already sort of very neurobiologically vulnerable, whether that is because they have difficulties engaging in sort of emotion regulation, so they can't sort of down regulate those social media experiences, or are hypersensitive to the rewarding features of their online lives, these adolescents can either be more at risk or sort of more resilient based on those sort of neural features that they come onto the platforms with.
Great, very helpful. We talked a little bit about uh, guidelines and delaying onset of use, not using screens at nighttime. Do some of the guidelines and recommendations related to sort of healthy screen time change as we develop? In other words, over time, are there different guidelines or different recommendations as young people mature?
That's a great question, and I don't think that that has been implemented. What is usually implemented, which actually doesn't come from a very evidence-based perspective, is sort of screen time limits, where a certain amount of screen time may or may not be recommended at different age groups. But other sort of guidelines, I think, should certainly be sort of developmentally changed across development, whether that is allowing certain features on the platforms, whether that is enabling or disabling these quantifiable metrics like the like button or other things, or the content certainly that individuals are exposed to should be geared to be developmentally appropriate. At no age is it ever appropriate to be exposed to misinformation or hate or body image comparisons. Those are certainly things that are going to be unhealthy, whomever one is, whatever the age is.
Right. And based on the questions that you all ask, I mean, that may drive the guidelines too, right? Like, what is your experience with the technology, right? So at any age, you might have different answers to those questions. And depending on the answers, that's the feedback that maybe drives some of the guideline, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's one of our goals is to do the science to help make recommendations to help either policymakers or schools make these different recommendations. For example, we're teaming up with a large number of schools around North Carolina to do some research that helps us understand what should be allowed in schools. Should adolescents be allowed to have their phones in school? Should they be completely locked up? Should they be allowed during breaks? What is the best?
Hot topic right now in the Chapel Hill Carver City Schools, I think,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah,
is the
yeah. We've
conversation
been
about whether or
working.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, we're in discussion with many of those schools as well because we really need evidence to help us make some of those decisions. It's certainly not good to have your phone out on social media during instructional time, but beyond that, and that's just sort of common sense. But beyond that, we don't actually know what would be the best rules to implement to help adolescents best thrive. We have some data. It's shocking to me. I don't know if it'd be shocking to you all, but we collected objective data from adolescent smartphones on how much they're on their phones across the day and across the night too. The nighttime use is also shocking. But what we see is during school hours, across every hour of the school day, they're on their phone for 20 minutes out of the hour of every hour of the day. So it's not like during lunchtime they get on their phone for the whole hour, but for every hour that they're in school, a third of that is spent behind their screen. And so I can't imagine that that's not disrupting their learning and ability to focus and engage during the school day. And so our question then is really, what can we do? What are some of the ways that we can help foster better tech use, healthier tech relationships in the school hours?
I know a crystal ball is always challenging, right? But as you look ahead over the next 5 and 10 years, sort of what are the interesting questions that you feel like the researchers, folks like yourself, are anticipating, right, on these issues? Social media, as you said, is not going away, but inevitably technology will change and the platforms will change. So as you look ahead, what are the interesting questions that you're interested in exploring further?
Yeah, this is, I think, compared to the research. So I didn't start studying social media use until about 6 or so years ago. And before studying social media, I could tell you what the future held because it was all sort of based on interests and what we were learning. And that didn't change so rapidly. With technology, I literally can't tell you what it's going to look like in a year. It is changing so quickly. Like just in the past couple months, we learned, and perhaps too late, that adolescents, like there's these AI facilitated social relationships that adolescents are developing now. And there are apps where adolescents have real relationships with not real people. And so this is becoming a new hot topic for us. Like, how is it that adolescents are navigating these sort of AI facilitated social relationships who are very real for adolescents? And what does that mean for their social relationships?
It's interesting as I sit here as a parent of a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, interesting to think about the decades ahead. We have a couple of minutes left. If anybody else has a question, in the meantime, I'll just mention, and we will put this back up on the screen in a second, but I do want to mention that we will be posting the CLE QR code for folks. So if you're waiting for a QR code, that's coming up in just a couple of minutes. Also wanted to mention before we get to the end that we have another mental health seminar coming up in April, and I'll repeat this again in just a few minutes. But as folks are thinking about any final questions for Dr. Telzer, the next presentation that we have is the rhythm of resilience: how music and creativity influence mental health, and that's coming up on April 8th at 3 p.m. So just a couple of announcements. Dr. Telzer, it doesn't look like there's any more questions that have come through. So maybe we've just covered all the landscape today, and now we've just got people out there thinking. But any sort of just closing thoughts or things, kind of key points that you'd like folks to leave with today?
Yeah, I think, this is such an interesting and relevant topic for everybody, whether you're navigating social media yourself or are a parent of a teenager or soon to be teenager. I think becoming more sort of literate in digital media is going to be more and more important for all of us. Get under the hood of technology and really understand it so that we can optimize it and make sure that we are engaging in social media either for ourselves or for our youth in ways that are the healthiest and in ways that limit some of those risks that I talked about today.
That's really helpful advice. I think being an informed consumer of everything is extremely important, right? And I think as I listen to you today, again, whether you are a parent or you are a young adult, a college student, a graduate student, a professor, faculty member, somebody who is a grown adult and using technology on your own, it's just so important that we understand what it is we are consuming, right? Whether it's on a little phone in front of our face or on a computer or on the radio or television or blog. It's just so important that we know who's giving the information. We know what the intent and purpose of the information being given to us is, to recognize that at the end of the day, we are consumers, right? And consumers are best served when they are aware of their role as consumers. And I think it's really powerful. And as you talked about the questions that you ask of your research participants and how you took the DSM questions from alcohol and other substances and sort of converted them to this, it's really informative, right? To think about like, how is this product that I'm consuming impacting my life, and is it uh, making things better or is it making things worse, right? Is it a pump or is it a drain? I think I heard somebody use that reference recently, right? In this so with respect to social media, right? Is it a pump or is it a drain? Is it contributing positively and making our lives better or your life better? Or is it having negative impacts on whether it's sleep or social experiences? So I want to thank you for your time today. It was exceptionally informative to me, and I think based on the questions that we had asked, really thought provoking for so many of our participants too. So thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That's awesome. This will be available. We have recorded this and it will be available for folks to be able to watch. I'm going to ask our awesome behind the scenes folks to put some slides up at this point so that we can talk about a few closing housekeeping items. So as I mentioned, upcoming mental health seminar, The Rhythm of Resilience, How Music and Creativity Influence Mental Health, will be on Tuesday, April the 8th from 3 until 4:30 p.m. More information is available at the Heals Care website, so care.unc.edu, and our mental health seminar page there on that site. CLE credit. There is CLE credit available for today's event. Sorry. There we go. Students to receive Campus Life Experience credit for today's presentation. Please scan that code. If you have questions, reach out to us and let us know how we can help you. And as you are looking at that and checking that out, I mentioned it, of course, a couple of times, but would love to encourage everybody who has not already and is not already familiar and does not have it bookmarked on their phone or computer. The Heals Care Network, care.unc.edu, is such an awesome resource for our campus and our community. So many people report back to us how helpful and informative and how much information relevant to their experience at Carolina is available through the Heals Care Network. Hundreds of thousands of visits since we launched that website a few years ago. And I encourage everybody to check out care.unc.edu for more information about these mental health seminar series and about all of the resources available here at Carolina related to mental health. I want to, for the close, thanking Dr. Eva Telzer for their presentation today. This was just a really wonderful hour and 20 minutes or so. I know I learned a lot about the topic. I hope you all took a lot away from it as well. These seminar series really have been so instrumental in helping inform our broader campus community about the intersection of mental health in so many topics. And so I look forward to future presentations. If you are interested in past presentations, you can find those on the care.unc.edu website. Thanks, everybody. We'll leave this QR code up for another minute or so, but we hope you had a great time today. We hope you will have a good week ahead. Please take care with some potential weather coming our way. Be safe, enjoy it if you can, and thank you for being here today. Thank you again, Dr. Telzer. This was really wonderful.